Good afternoon, science fiction mystery thriller fans. Today we're going into Book 3, Wrath and Retribution of the Guardsman series. We are at episode 29, chapters 71 through 72. So, please sit back, relax, and enjoy. When you get done, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Appreciate you. Thank you very much.
The Guardsman, Book 3, Wrath and Retribution, Episode 29, Chapters 71 through 72. Chapter 71. Samson opened his eyes with a splitting headache and dry mouth, feeling slightly disoriented from the flooding rush of his life's memories over 2 decades prior. The series of dreams had assaulted him like the days they had happened all tumbled together. The first was pleasant, but the second left him feeling like he was still experiencing it. It took him several breaths to realize that he was indeed older, and these injuries were fresh, not inflicted by the dream. The confusion between the threshold of waking and jarring dreams was disorienting, made worse by the fog of painkillers. He was stiff and sore like he had spent all day lifting weights, not stretched after, and then had laid stationary for hours. The glare from the lighting was oppressive, like it was being shined directly into his brain straight through his closed lids. With an irritated groan, he turned his head to the left. The stabs of pain and protesting muscles in his neck and back made him wish he hadn't. Cracking his eyes, knowing he wasn't going to be able to sleep any more, the 3 human-shaped shadows solidified into Persephone and her mother and father. Samson's painful irritation at waking up in such miserable conditions quickly turned to confusion as he looked around the unfamiliar room, washed out in glaring light, turning his eyes only. Since everything else hurt to move, including his grumpy waking-up face, he decided not to push his luck. Why everyone was looking at him was disconcerting. Why he was in a strange bed was puzzling. How he arrived here was confusing, and why Lady Selene was in a similarly uncomfortable bed next to him was baffling. Persephone leaned forward and shoved something cold between his lips. Her only instruction was, "Open." Curiosity gave way to trust, and Samson realized it was an ice chip. The sweet explosion of cold and wet water in his mouth tasted better than any meal he had ever had. The prone Lady Selene was the first to sarcastically assault him. "So, Mr. First Gladiator of the Empire, what has been running through your head the last 3/4 of an hour?" Baffled by the question, a different question of his own arrived in his mind. All he could croak through his dried tongue and lips was, "Time?" Lady Selene looked sunken and pale in her bed. The fluid tubes running into her from every direction indicated a hospital of some kind as his brain started coming up to speed. Philip grumbled, "Almost time for dinner, and time for you to answer the question." Persephone's face flicked out of view behind her hair as she glared over her shoulder at her father, turning back to Samson and rolling her eyes with a smile. To spite Philip Kroinos, she rapidly dropped 3 more ice chips into Samson's mouth, so he couldn't reply immediately. Samson retried his voice, and this time it worked a little better than the last attempt. "I was dreaming about the first day of school." The CEO snapped, "Bullshit boy." Samson's eyes flicked to hard, and back again when he realized he had just challenged the CEO of the hegemony with that look. Philip exhaled once through his smile and continued, "No one growls and snarls thinking about their first day of school. School's not that bad, and you know it. You look like a guard dog dreaming about someone trying to steal his bone." Samson's eyes dropped shut with fatigue, and he shook his head minusculely when Persephone applied an ice chip to his lips. When it disappeared, he continued, "The first part was fine. That was just school stuff. The second part was Academy and Processing Day, actually before." I was 5. Since I was an orphan, with no parents, I was alone. I still took the test before. Persephone sat back, in silence, with a curious expression. She had never heard this story before. Samson continued. Announced my acceptance at breakfast in the creche. After I finished breakfast, I was told to pack. Didn't have much, so I was done when the older boys came into my billeting wing. Open bay, metal bunks, too high. I was on the bottom. During his pause, Samson accepted a few more chips of ice to soothe his throat. His brain was catching up to the fact that the massive doses of painkillers his nano-S were clearing out of his system were causing his dehydration. The 3 of them cornered me while I was checking my packing. I broke one of their noses, the one on the left side, punched him good, in the middle of the face. The other 2 got a hold of my neck and kicked out my feet, slammed my head into the corner of the bunk and the locker. Samson flexed his left hand and discovered it was only mildly sore. Slowly moving his arm up to the level of his forehead, he pulled apart the short hair on the right side of his head. Since that side was facing the lighting above them, the 3 in his audience could see the shadowed triangular dent in his skull just inside the hairline and in front of the ear. Landed on my back. Then they started kicking me. I kicked back and got one of them between his legs. They were older, so it hurt him more. Pulled myself under the bunk, but they got my bag. Left me alone, but tore up my stuff. Samson considered his next statement while the 2 ice chips Persephone fed him dissolved. Told me I was nothing but trash, 'cause I thought I was better than the rest of 'em. The one who wasn't kicked or blooded said, "Ain't no way you gonna make da fancy school, and when you fail you ask gonna right back air." They kicked at me a few more times while I was under the bunk. Kicked and scattered all of my clothes and stuff around. Then they left. I never saw them again. Promised I would never fail and would never quit. Philip was the first to break the long silence. I think that would set me to growling too. Celine groaned at her uncouth husband while lightly slapping his upper arm, and Persephone coughed a quick laugh as she ran her hand over Samson's head and scar before feeding him a few more ice chips. Samson groaned and grumbled when he tried to move his stiffening body. How and why are we all here? Last I remember I was eating at Vlad's, steak and eggs for breakfast. Now you say it's dinner time. Philip groused. Well, funny you should ask. Samson cringed, squinted his eyes, and rolled his mouth in distaste, as Philip used the old Guardsman joke for something you weren't going to want to hear. Philip continued without noticing Samson's reaction. You finished 2.5 plates of food and washed it down with water and milk. You sat back in the middle of the conversation and just watched for a little while. It was almost noon before we realized you had fallen into Guardsman protective sleep with your eyes open. Samson's distastefully crunched frown set both women to smiling. Philip continued, We loaded you onto the transports, and when we lifted, I got the news about Celine and Diantha. Confused again, Samson asked, Diantha? Philip pointed past Samson's shoulder to a space behind his prone body. Samson turned his head away to follow the CO's finger, hearing and feeling his neck grind stiffly against itself thanks to his sore muscles and misaligned vertebrae due to his grudge match with Alexio's. The only part of Diantha he recognized was her red hair. Her face was carefully bandaged, turning it anonymously hospital white. She had 7 different trees of fluids draining into her unconscious body. The patches of skin that were showing were either bruised horrifically or pale and bluish, as she recovered slowly from the blood loss and transfusions, along with the cocktail of powerful drugs draining into her body. Irritated Samson looked back at Philip. Philip said simply, Casimir. The disdain, anger, and disgust in that simple name told Samson everything he needed to know, as pieces began falling into place in his head. He asked past his own dry and cracking throat, "And Lady Seline?" Philip looked down at his wife, who smiled back at him. "Found what the bastard did while I was kicking you two out of bed. She did an on-the-spot transfusion to save Diantha's life. The young lady actually died, but the medics revived her. The Home Guard platoon's combat medics stuck Seline right there in Diantha's bedroom. Luckily, their blood types are compatible. They have dropped her into a medically induced coma until the swelling in her brain goes down. The broken bones have been set as best as possible given her condition, and her teeth are being regenerated for reimplantation when her jaw is rebuilt. The rest are cosmetic or flesh wounds that will heal with time and care. She has only very few organic nanobots since she lost so much blood, and the ones infused from Seline had to be deactivated because of their different DNA. It's become a painstaking process repairing the damage, and we can't have her moving around. That bastard Casimir came into work. He pretty much only looked around and wandered off. Like I said this morning at the breakfast table, except now it has only gotten worse. He has been missing for over 10 hours now, and is completely off the surveillance grid." Samson injected after a long pause, "which means the bastard doesn't want to be found. His face is documented enough that scans would find him. Were he acting normally? With his position, he would know how to deliberately avoid scans, so he can't feign ignorance of those techniques." His anger growing, Samson continued, "Since he doesn't want to be found, his father shot himself in the head rather than face disgrace for his crimes. That doesn't look good. And since he was controlling the hit squads using corporate assets, chances are both were using their security and intelligence positions and conspiring to destroy Persephone and perhaps the whole family over the last year at least. And probably the last 20 that family members have been dying much more rapidly than actuarial tables would allow." Samson sat up with a groan. Against Persephone's protesting hand, son of a bitch, everything in his body popped and protested at the same time. Samson shook his head at Persephone, and she reluctantly dropped her hand. While he was stretching his shoulders, Persephone asked, "What do actuarial tables have to do with anything?" Samson started. "They are just an insurance tool to statistically track probable causes of death and injury so they can write policies and set premiums." Persephone rolled her eyes and violently flicked her middle finger against Samson's thick skull, the only part of his body that wasn't already throbbing in pain. The tap echoed in his head and ears and drew his undivided attention. "I know what they are, you bonehead. I asked what they have to do with anything." Samson started over again. "Oh, sorry, I'm still not up to speed. It is where I began all of my investigations when I was working as an investigator for Mario. If I were looking at fraud or suspected arson, I would look at the probabilities of occurrence and then compare them to what was being investigated. If there was a statistical variance like 3 fires with the same company causing losses, I would start to look at things like arson instead of accident. So many members of this family have died of unnatural causes, I should have started looking sooner. I'm an idiot." Philip's exhale was so deep and profound that it pulled Samson out of his self-loathing. "No, Samson, I think that fault rests more with me than anyone. I have suspected for years that we were under attack. I just never thought it was my own brother and nephew who could possibly have been slaughtering our babies." Seline gripped his hand so tight her knuckles went white as her head rolled away from view. She didn't explode in rage when Philip said it, so that quiet logical part of Samson suspected that he and Seline had quietly discussed the possibilities before, and both had labored to keep the burden quiet so they could trap the perpetrators. I put my brother in a position of the greatest trust, and he abused that trust, and our children paid for it. Samson's feet swung over the floor from the infirmary bed, and he snapped, "Bullshit." Persephone sat back alarmed before trying and failing to push him back into bed. "You sure didn't do anything wrong by trusting your family. They are the ones who conspired and murdered. They are the ones who destroyed their kin for personal gain. They are monsters." Philip asked, "Where are you going?" Samson told them, "First, I'm going to find my clothes. Then I'm going to track that wretched bastard down, rip his heart out of his chest with my bare hands, and eat it in front of him while he dies gasping." Persephone's left hand drifted down to settle on the top of his right as he was about to thrust himself off the infirmary bunk. He froze and looked at her. She spoke softly but clearly. "We have hundreds of people in half a dozen intelligence sections scouring the planet for him. He is grounded, and all transports are checked for anyone with a DNA scan, bone structures, and retinal scan resembling anything close to his records. Anyone close to his records is pulled aside and scanned in detail. Samson, there is nothing you can do right now that isn't being done by others. Right now, your only job is to stay where you are and recover your health." Samson's reply was a frustrated grunt. His feet never touched the floor as he slipped grumbling back into the infirmary bed. Persephone's parents shared a look before both parents looked questioningly at the pair. Chapter 72. The gentle, throat-clearing hum ripped Samson from the pleasant dream of stroking warm silk with his fingers. Decades of trained reflexes coiled him instantly, which painfully snapped any lingering sleep fatigue from his mind as his damaged body shrieked protests along every imaginable millimeter of nerves in his body, while his uncontrolled groan rasped through his dry throat. A softer protesting caught his ear to the left. His startled and protectively recoiled left hand relaxed as he woke more fully, and his hand fell back to the sleep-tousled hair that ran down the back of the freshly roused Persephone's neck and shoulders. Her blurry eyes and reddened, wrinkled face told his hazy brain instantly that she had slept all night in the chair next to his bedside. She groaned softly as she pushed both thumbs back over her ears, dragging her hair back from her eyes. Samson just watched and waited until she had finished her wrist-twisting girl hair fixing magic and snapped her hair clamp thing into place. The doctor, who stood quietly ignored at the foot of the hospital bed, busied himself with the evening's chart on a digital reader connected to the monitors. Samson croaked past his dry throat. "Good morning, beautiful." He coughed and tried to swallow away some of the unpleasant dryness from his mouth and throat, while gently holding the back of her neck and running his thumb softly down her skin. He continued a little more strongly, "Did you sleep here all night?" She was rubbing the sleep from her eyes as he asked, and when she heard the question, didn't bother responding verbally. Her head dropped to the side, and she sighed past pursed lips and sleepy but expressive eyes that just said, "You know I did, so why ask?" Samson grumbled slightly as he rolled his fingers past her ear before allowing her right cheek to fall to his palm. "I guess you're right. That was a bone-headed question." He sniffed and blinked himself, clearing his own eyes, before smiling at her and pointing with his pained but functional right arm. "You've got wrinkles?" She looked distressed for a second under the perpetual female fear of aging wrinkles before he corrected, "From the sheets, you didn't move all night. Silly woman, your neck and back are probably going to be sore all day from sleeping like that. You should have gone to your own bed." Persephone leaned back, breaking their physical contact. She awkwardly and painfully stretched her own abused back before pressing her hands to her neck. She groaned while pinching its length with her hands stacked along her muscles from both sides. She muttered, before she finished, "You know the answer to that too." Her eyes slipped closed, and she groaned in her own pain as she rolled and pressed her neck, desperately trying to work out the kinks. The doctor played with his readouts and started to shuffle to Persephone's side as they started to close their personal conversation. He interjected again with a soft hum, gently clearing his throat again to let them know he didn't actually have all day to stand there. Samson grumbled. "What do you want, Sawbones?" Persephone huffed and turned pleasantly to the family's physician. "Good morning, Sean. It's good to see you again." As a private physician for her family, he had literally known her since she was knee-high. He favored her with a warm smile due to a close family member out of the house for far too long. He finally spoke. "You too, Miss Persephone. But I'm afraid your knuckle-dragger is probably correct about you being sore after sleeping like that. I won't tell him that, or he'll get a big head. Correction, a bigger head, and then he will be even more incorrigible. He only has to get lucky once with a diagnosis, and he'll hold it over my head, second-guessing me all the time, for the rest of his life. He'll never mind how many other times he's wrong, as he never follows the doctor's orders again." Persephone smiled. "It really is good to see you, Sean, and don't worry about him. He'll do what he's told." Persephone stepped back and away from the stool she had slept sitting in all night. Sean used a foot to push it under the bed as he stepped between her and the readouts and equipment at the left side of the bed's head. He started fussing with that pile of techno-jumble medical equipment. Sean shrugged. "If you can train this grumbling primate to follow the doctor's orders, Miss Persephone, you'll be the first." She hovered behind the doctor, looking at his equipment and the readouts over his shoulder while she sniped, "It's the breed. They're all difficult to housebreak, but loyal to a fault. Besides, this one's well-trained." Samson intentionally tried, but failed miserably at ignoring both of them and quietly grumbled at the converging jabs. "I hate you both. It's too early in the morning to deal with your—" Something cold and hard slapped hard into the crook of his sore arm, violently interrupting him. "Ouch." Sean muttered disinterestedly, "Wimp." He held his cold metal sensor probe firmly in place over the soft skin of Samson's arm inside his prone elbow, drawing blood and collecting a dozen other readings. He was silent for a few moments while his system quickly analyzed Samson's blood and those dozen other vital statistics more accurately than the basic suite of sensors in the bed could manage. "Well, here's a news flash. You'll live, bad attitude and all. Elevated lactic acid levels, with your nano-S happily working like they're supposed to, given your situation. You also have plenty of blood sugars and everything a growing body needs to repair your bumps, bruises, contusions, lacerations, and assorted other souvenirs from the other night." Dr. Sean eyed him and then told him, "Your accelerated Guardsman healing appears to be working normally." Sean reached his right hand gently over the vitals probe he'd left in place. He lifted and slipped down the top of Samson's hospital gown to inspect his collarbones. The flesh was still mashed, ripped, and bruised from his fight, but visibly improved. He muttered, "Hard to believe that all this happened on Friday night and it's only Sunday morning." He continued his description. "No infection evident, as is normal with your military-grade nano-regiment. And the healing and scabbing is normal for a Guardsman. Just stay lying back like you are. I've already seen your back when I bandaged it, and I think I can gauge its mending based on these." He sighed and continued in an aside. "I'm typically not a fan of the violence that goes into the creation of the wounds that my profession spends so much time mending. However, in this case, I could hardly avoid the vid. It definitely makes my diagnosis that much easier. Instead of extracting details from my sedated, inebriated, and often otherwise recalcitrant patients, I actually got to watch everything that happened, and since it was recorded for posterity, I can review the vid to aid in my diagnosis. That said, I need to steal your blanket and look at that contusion on your thigh. Samson audibly grumbled at the loss of the blanket, but he mostly feared losing it because Persephone would see just how ugly it was after Alexios had broken Samson's sword over his thigh. It felt like he had a numb but painfully throbbing hole in his leg, and he really didn't look forward to seeing the wound for himself again. Persephone's overprotective huff was predictable when the blanket pulled away from the painfully raised contusion. It was still deeply purpled and peripherally yellowed, with internal bleeding seeping into the soft flesh of his thigh. Samson wanted to sit up and cover his leg. Sean was leaning forward and warned him as he saw him tense. "Samson, if you sit up and rip open the bandaging I have on your back, I will make sure that your stay here is both long and painfully unpleasant." His instructions continued impassively. "When I tell you to stay lying back, I mean it." His tone shifted as he leaned back and quickly tapped through a sequence of medical screens Samson couldn't see. Sean leaned forward with the probe again. "I'm going to get a sample of the blood in that contusion. It's a non-standard test that shouldn't be necessary, but I want to make sure your nano-S are still working there." With the steady hands of a surgeon, Sean leaned forward and very gently used his probe, so it landed like a discomfort-free butterfly touching for just long enough to get the readings he was looking for with that sample. He leaned back and read his results. "Yup, they're still working there." He muttered more to himself. "There's always that 1 in a million chance that something strange could be happening in there. I could actually see where your sword's cross guard sunk into your thigh before that blade broke. I tell you, Samson, that must have hurt like nothing I ever wanted to know." Samson drew a breath to tell Sean that it wasn't that bad. Persephone cut him off by mumbling, "Don't even think about saying what I know you're thinking about saying, Samson Rockpoint. I can hear the rusty gears squeaking in your head." Still, with his back to Persephone, Sean smiled at Samson and rolled his eyes. Samson kept a calmly schooled expression before Sean spoke. "I'm going to do a body scan. I watched some of the hits you were taking, so I'm pretty sure you have injuries that your nano-S won't fix, like bones and structures out of alignment. I know your back is in rough shape. I heard that cracking over the vid feeds, but I want to make sure everything else is in place too. I don't want to release you and then find out that your right knee is out of the socket because of that hammer blow you took to your thigh, for example. I know you won't like it, but I'll probably need to close the scuffs on your back too." Before Samson could protest, Sean cut him off. I know. Leave your scars alone. Stupid Guardsman. I'll make sure I leave you just enough that you can be in pain and grumpy for a few days while you heal naturally." Samson just nodded at the sound logic and submitted to Sean's able care. Sean was not only the family's physician, but was the medical support for the resident guardsmen. He provided first responder emergency care for the Citadel personnel and visitors. He was also the supporting primary care physician for the Home Guard Battalion. Thanks to those nut jobs, he had plenty of experience cleaning up bumps, bruises, bar fight scuffs, and drunken accidents. Persephone remained gravely silent, but moved to the end of the bed where she would be out of the way. Sean played with his jumble of medical electronics, and the scanner left the wall at the head of the bed and traversed down and back up along Samson's body, cataloging the injuries and state of his body for comparison versus Samson's own records and human normal. Sean had always humored the little girl when she managed to smuggle the random stray kitten or puppy into the Citadel when she was much younger. He had done the health scans on those animals for her without complaint. and even given her a copy of the creature's clean bill of health or record of treatment and care instructions for animals that needed assistance. Invariably, a copy of those reports had always found its way into her mother's papers too. He was always glad that Celine had handled it with such a class through the years. Persephone was allowed to make sure her creatures were healthy when Celine would find them and have the "you shouldn't sneak animals into our home" without asking first talk with Persephone. Her punishment lesson for sneaking was always to find a good home for her latest rescue pet. She could never keep them because she had been sneaking them and not asking like she should have. She never learned and just kept finding new pets thinking she'd get away with it the next time. And then Samson showed up. He should have known something was running through Persephone's head all that time when she never snuck another rescue animal into the citadel once Samson was there. That thought in crystal clear retrospect snapped firmly into place for him when, as he watched live, he saw the upwelling of emotions as she jumped into his arms after the brutal and bloody contest that had taken place less than 36 hours before. The scanner finished its track, and he sighed to himself as the screen lit with red and orange non-life threatening indicators he still had to deal with before he could release Samson. Sean's palm slapped to the screen, and he turned it so both Samson and Persephone could see. He began at the head and started working down to the toes. Other than the uniform and obvious Guardsman brain damage, as I suspected Samson, you have 3 vertebrates in your neck out of alignment. Both of your shoulders have mild separations. Your scapulae themselves are bruised, and the meniscus between your bones and ribs are damaged. Your whole back is out of alignment. Sean's fingers traced the string of red and orange directional indicators that grew in intensity along where his ribs had been crushed back and his back had been bruised under the pulling force that had almost killed him. You still have mild bruising on your liver, kidneys, and a few other organs, even after all the healing you've done since the contest. All of these are healing normally, but we should still take some time today to fix those issues. Organ failure after I release you today will just busy my afternoon, so best to take care of things correctly the first time. His fingers traced down. Your right hip and knee are both hyper-extended and strained. He tapped Samson's right ankle. And how you broke your ankle I can't figure out, but you wandered around on it broken for the last day and a half. Persephone snapped angrily, "Well, why in Hade's name didn't you fix him sooner?" Sean's eyes flashed with an instant of intense anger that Samson had never seen from the man before. It faded and Sean calmly pointed from the digital controls across Samson to the prone Diantha in the next bed over. "I didn't work on Samson," using the name he always called her when she brought home strays and had him do health checks on them, young lady. "It's because he was stabilized with no life-threatening injuries. He has the powerful Guardsman nanobots to rectify the vast majority of his injuries given time without my attention. Diantha, on the other hand, lost so much blood that her own substantially less capable civilian version organic nanobot population dropped so low that they were critically, almost fatally, ineffective at stabilizing her wounds. I had to do everything on her by hand all night in the trauma ward, while you slept peacefully these last many hours. I have performed 3 separate invasive surgeries on her just to keep her vitals stable and to reform her cracked rib cage, so bone shards didn't puncture her lungs or heart. Where do you think she went when she was wheeled out of here so suddenly yesterday afternoon? And you were asleep early this morning when I had to cut her open to work on her for the 3rd time because her heart was stopping again. So, if you don't mind, young lady, I'm the doctor here, and I just might know what I'm doing when it comes to triaging my patients. May I please continue from where I was interrupted, with your permission?" Persephone visibly clamped her jaw closed around her anger and struggled with an apology. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Sean reminded her harshly, "You didn't ask." He shook his head scoldingly at the little girl who should behave like the woman her years represented. Fortunately, with Samson's case, I didn't have to open him at all. I do think that the strains in the right leg will be irritating, but I'd like to use traction and alignment therapy to crack everything into place. Since NanoS can't move bones but can fix soft tissue with ease, I'll do the bones first. I'll pop the bones into the right place and then use the wand to focus on the breaks and cracks, followed by the joint damage, and finally the superficial bruises. Samson interrupted softly, "Don't louse up my scars, Doc. Chicks dig scars." Sean groaned at the common and often repeated Guardsman line. It was still babbling idiocy that he'd already addressed once in their conversation. Persephone rumbled her leftover irritation from Sean's earlier rebuke at Samson. "You better not be showing any other chicks your scars, or I'll cut your balls off and keep them in my purse." Samson cringed, trying not to laugh. Even Sean struggled to keep his treatment description professionally level. "I think it will take about an hour to mend the breaks. I figure 2 or 3 hours of traction and alignment, with some gentle electroshock and pharma treatment to relax the muscles. I'll take a break during that. Nothing for me to really do at that point anyway. I'll get some rest and be back to do some focused treatment of the internal wounds and close the largest external wounds." By rote, Samson was about to remind him about leaving his scars. Persephone silenced him by studiously avoiding his damaged right leg, but casually flicked his left foot's big toe. He immediately stopped thinking about talking. Sean ignored the byplay. "I think I'll stretch out the alignment through lunchtime. It's only just after 08 in the morning, so I'll run the alignment through 1300 and I'll start repairing the minor stuff after that." He scooped the nano-guide wand from its tray on the medical devices and used it to start assembling Samson's nanobots by his damaged left scapula bone. Sean joked half-heartedly, "I've spent about 14 of the last 22 hours in surgery, so if I fall asleep standing up, just make sure I'm comfortable." Samson suggested, "If you're so tired, why don't you have someone else do it?" Sean shrugged, his fatigue showing. "As tired as I am, are you sure you want someone who's not a trauma surgeon rated guiding your body's nanobots in 3-dimensional manipulation to tear apart and rebuild your internal muscular skeletal system?" Samson said dryly, "I see your point." Sean shrugged. "I've been working for about 5 or 6 hours with 2-hour cat naps in between. It's just been a long day." Samson relaxed and let the work progress, while Persephone settled in for a long wait.
Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate your listening. When you get a chance, please come and hit the like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check out the book for real down in the description.